Welcome to the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum's Zoom series, Trolleyology. My name is Kristen Fredrickson. I'm the Assistant Manager of Visitor Experience here at the museum. Thanks again for joining us today, and welcome back to many of you who I have seen here before many times. This virtual series features programs on Pennsylvania transit history topics and stories about the trolley era, like today, and our collection that you can experience from home, usually a Wednesday or a Tuesday. And we're going to continue these programs regularly. So if you have a show that you would like to share that fits the museum mission, please let me know. That'd be anything about Pennsylvania, the trolley era, cities where our streetcars come from. And if you have a program that doesn't quite fit those guidelines, please reach out anyway. And we have a full list of upcoming presentations on our website, patrolley.org, which I will share in the chat box in just a few minutes. And I want to extend a very, very special thank you to those of you who donated when registering for tonight's program, and those of you who have made donations through our website. We really, really appreciate your support of our virtual outreach programs. So most of you know all about the museum already, but for those of you who may be new, we were established in 1954 as the Arden Electric Railway by a group of trolley enthusiasts called the Pittsburgh Electric Railway Club. And we opened to visitors a few years later in 1963, and we're located along the former route of the interurban line between Pittsburgh and Washington, PA. You'll find almost 50 trolleys and electric railway cars here, about 20 of which operate, and about 30,000 visitors per year take the 4-mile scenic ride at the museum. And before we get started today, I did want to give you guys a couple updates. We have walls. It's been a very mild winter here in southwestern Pennsylvania, which I'm sure is good for the contractors for our new Welcome and Education Center seen here on the left. I don't have a picture yet, but this week they are working on the canopy along Volunteer Boulevard, which is the brick paved street on the other side of this building, kind of between that building and then the red building behind it there. That's our trolley display building. On the right-hand side, you see some restoration efforts. We have 3 trolleys in our shop right now that are due to get new canvas roofs. And this isn't something that's done every day. So we're grateful for everybody who's given us tips on how to do this. So you can see it's definitely a team effort there on car 73. And before they get to the left photo, the photo on the right shows one of our volunteers, Jack, painting for the Philadelphia car 8042 behind him. So progress is getting made on that car as well. Now on the left side, this trolley, Jersey Shore and Annie's Fort number 3, was previously on top of a railroad flat car, and it was like way up high in the air. And to better interpret the story of what happened to trolleys after they were done being used by the transit systems, we are actually going to display this car as a hunting cabin. That's what it was in its post-trolley life, along with its sister car number 1. A lot of people call this the trolley with 9 lives because first it survived scrapping, and then it survived Hurricane Agnes in 1972 when it was lifted off of its foundation in the flood and beaten up against a railroad bridge. So the trolley eventually made its way to the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum, and it's going to be displayed as a hunting cabin. So if anybody on this call has 1950s or 60s furniture or decor, we are seeking that. So reach out to us after the program. And one more announcement from our friends at the East Penn Traction Club. They are holding their East Penn Traction Meet, the 26th National Model Trolley Meet, in May over in Allentown. So you can go to eastpenn.org/meet. Every odd numbered year, the East Penn Club has a meet. And then on the even years, the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum hosts the West Penn Trolley Meet. So that'll be back over on our side of the state in 2024. At some point. So definitely check that out if you're into trolley models or trolley fun. All right, so now without further ado, I would like to introduce today's presenter, Eric Madison. Since 1998, Mr. Madison has been a volunteer streetcar operator with the National Capital Trolley Museum in Colesville, Maryland. And he serves in multiple roles, which include being a member of the Board of Trustees, the museum's safety officer and superintendent of railway operations, and the museum's secretary. In addition to his volunteer work with the museum, Mr. Madison has an extensive career in transit with a focus on rail transit safety and oversight of heavy rail, light rail, and streetcar systems. Over the course of his transit career, he's worked for the DC Department of Transportation's Office of Mass Transit, where he conducted planning for the DC streetcar and served as State Safety Oversight Program Manager for safety oversight of the Washington Metro Rail system. He then served as a team lead with the Department of Defense to coordinate shuttle, transit, and commuter bus operations for the Pentagon and Mark Center in Virginia. Following the Department of Defense, he worked as a program manager for the FTA's Office of Transit Safety and Oversight to provide program and technical support to 14 state safety oversight programs around the country. And currently, he serves as a senior consultant with Dovetail Consulting as a safety and security expert on state safety oversight, agency projects, and for rail transit agency clients. So at the end of the presentation, we will be able to have a question and answer session with Eric, but the chat box will be open, so please feel free to enter questions and comments during the show, and we'll be able to read through those at the end. And just to note, this program is being recorded and will be shared within the next few weeks on our YouTube channel. So please, at this time, turn off your videos. We'll turn those on again at the end of the program. We'll keep our microphones muted as well, and I will invite you to unmute yourselves at the end. All right, I'm really looking forward to tonight's program. It'll be a little bit different than usual. Eric, if you're ready, take it away.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Kristen. And I would like to thank you again for inviting me to speak on this topic. This is a topic that's kind of near and dear to me, and it's always exciting to kind of share this with other people. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen and have this up, and then let's see. Let's start this. 1 second. And there we go. All right. So again, my name is Eric Madison. I'm a member of the National Capital Trolley Museum in Colesville, Maryland. And my topic this evening is going to be on Jim Crow on streetcars. This is going to be a discussion about some of the practices and customs on Jim Crow streetcars. But also, I'm going to split my presentation into two main parts. Part is going to be on challenges or African Americans' attempts to challenge access to streetcars as passengers, and then challenging the customs and practices. And then the second part will be on challenging the discrimination and gaining equal access to streetcars and public transit, as I use the term, on the platform, so both as employees of the transit company. Hopefully, I think this should probably take me about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time left at the end for Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and start. Just a little bit of background about myself, a personal background. I grew up in Lexington, Kentucky, and this is a short video clip of Lexington, Kentucky in the mid-1950s. Lexington did have streetcars at one time, but by the time that this home movie footage was shot in the mid-1950s, streetcars were gone. However, I wanted to include this because it kind of sets the start of my story, because during this time when this footage was filmed, my parents were living in Lexington. Both of my parents are from Lexington, and they were coming of age in Lexington around this time. They were both teenagers in the mid-50s, coming out of high school, starting college. And one of the things they would always talk about were their experiences riding on the transit buses. That is one of the buses that they would ride on. And, Lexington being a southern city, the buses were segregated. And, my mother and father would talk about the different experiences that they had. My mother was a very light-skinned woman who would often take the bus every week to her piano lesson. And she would talk about some of the routes that she would ride on, where she could basically sit anywhere that she wanted, because she did not appear as a person of color, so she wouldn't be challenged sometimes. My father, on the other hand, was darker skinned, and so he would often talk about riding in the back of the bus. And there were certain routes that if you, as a person of color, weren't sitting in the designated area of the bus, sometimes people would throw rocks at the bus and break the windows. But I say all of this to kind of set the framework for where I'd like to start this, because around this time in the 1950s, we start to see the civil rights movement really starting to gain momentum. And so I'm going to go from Lexington, Kentucky to just a little farther south to Montgomery, Alabama. We're familiar with Rosa Parks and her involvement in the civil rights movement. This is a photograph of Mrs. Parks taken after the bus boycott ended in 1956. So we know that on December 1st of 1955, Ms. Parks boarded a bus to go home from work. She was told by the bus operator to give up her seat to a white person. She then refused, was placed under arrest, and as a result of her arrest, the Montgomery bus boycott began and lasted for, I think, a little over a year, finally ending with the desegregation of buses in Montgomery. When I learned about this particular event, it was taught to me as if this was a one-off event, that Mrs. Parks did what she did because she was coming home from work as a seamstress at a department store, and she was very tired that day and she didn't want to give up her seat. Well, if you look back at some of the history of Mrs. Parks and her work in activism, you'll find that what she did on that day in 1955 was not an accident, and it wasn't a spur of the moment decision. This was a very thought out and planned action on her part and the part of the African American community. Ms. Parks had worked for a number of years with the NAACP. She had actually been, I think, a secretary with them. She had received training at the Highlander Center in Tennessee, where she would learn nonviolent methods of challenging discrimination. She had actually traveled at one point through the South, reporting, getting firsthand accounts of people who had been victims of racial violence. So it was a very planned activity of what she did that day. And so in researching this particular topic for this discussion, what I found was that what Mrs. Parks did on that day was not an isolated event, but instead it's part of a very long history of people of color in the United States challenging the practices, the customs, and then the laws behind racial segregation, particularly in areas regarding public access to public transportation. So where I'm really going to go back now is I'm actually going to go farther back in history and to the north. The perception about segregation was that it was a very kind of specifically Southern practice. It's found primarily in the South. But what we're going to find through my discussion this evening is that that wasn't actually the case. So if we go back to the 19th century, we're actually going to start in New York City. A little bit of history about public transportation. We know that early public transportation in cities was primarily provided by omnibuses, which were essentially horse-drawn stagecoaches that would operate over fixed routes. This is a photograph of a group of omnibuses down at South Ferry at the lower tip of Manhattan. So even then, South Ferry was a major transportation hub. But as cities grew and people came to rely on omnibuses even more, they found that these were not very practical modes of transportation. They were pulled by horses. They often got stuck in the mud if the roads weren't in good condition. And so there had to be a new answer or a new type of technology that could improve urban mass transit. That would come in the form of the horse-drawn streetcar. In the 1830s, the company, the New York and Harlem Railroad, is credited with being one of the earliest horse car operators in the United States and in New York City. At this time, though, there was an event that would occur actually in 1854, which would be one of the earliest challenges to the practice of segregation. So in New York City at this time, when horse cars were being introduced, it was the practice that horse cars were actually segregated by race. So unlike some practices where African Americans would be required to ride either on the platform or in certain areas of the car, In some cases, the custom was that companies would actually provide separate cars for African American and for white passengers. Obviously, this presents a challenge because if a car shows up first, whichever one shows up first, people are going to board it. But one event in 1854 would challenge the practice of racial segregation on horse cars in New York City. And actually, as a result of the case that came about, it would actually end this practice. So we start in 1854, and in July of 1854, a woman by the name of Elizabeth Jennings would board a car that was operated by the Third Avenue Railway. Ms. Jennings, she would later be Jennings Graham, as you can see here. This photograph is taken later in her life, but in 1854, she was a 24-year-old African-American woman who came from a fairly prominent African-American family. Her father was an entrepreneur and a philanthropist, and her mother was part of an organization of African-American abolitionist women. So Ms. Jennings had a very kind of strong understanding of who she was and kind of her place in society. And on the evening of July 16th, 1854, she was returning to church. She was the church organist for her congregation, and she boarded a Third Avenue car. The conductor informed her that she might be more comfortable riding on the platform where African Americans were assigned. And so she said that she would not ride on the platform, that she was going to sit in the car with the other passengers. And as a result of the altercation between her and the streetcar conductor, she was forcibly removed from the streetcar. And so rather than let the incident end there, she decided to sue the Third Avenue Railway. And so she ends up being represented. Her attorney was Chester A. Arthur, who would later become president of the United States. But he argued that the streetcar company was in the wrong and that employees of the streetcar companies had an obligation to essentially represent their company in the best light. But as a result of the case, she would actually win this case, and she was awarded $225 as a result of this. And in the decision that was handed down by the judge, he essentially said that any person of color who was going about their lawful business essentially should have equal access to public transportation. And as a result of this case, the Third Avenue Railway and subsequent streetcar companies and public transit providers in New York City would not use the practice of segregation on their streetcars and later cars. And I think actually today there is a street named after her in Lower Manhattan where the incident occurred. But it's kind of the first example that we see here with my discussion on how an individual will challenge the practice of segregation, one, and how that challenge can actually be successful. So it was actually, in reading this, I was, pleasantly surprised to see that Ms. Jennings did win her case and was awarded money, but also that she, as a result of this, that the practice of segregation did end in New York City. Now, if we come south a little bit to the nation's capital, around this same time, streetcars in Washington were just getting their start. The first company was founded in 1862, Washington and Georgetown, during the Civil War. And also as a result of that, part of the reason that streetcars came to Washington was because of the huge influx of population due to the Civil War. So you had the city grew by several thousands. And in 1864, a similar event would occur that would also lead to the end of racial segregation on streetcars in the nation's capital. This was credited to a gentleman by the name of Dr. Alexander T. Augusta. He was an officer in the Union Army. He was a surgeon. And in 1864, he boarded a horse car to go to a hospital where he had to pick up some notes to go to a case where he was testifying. He boarded the horse car that was operated by the Washington and Georgetown at the time. And similar to Ms. Jennings, he was informed by the conductor that he would have to ride on the rear platform of the car. And when he refused to do so, he was ejected from the car, and then the conductor gave the instructions to the operator to leave, and so he ended up having to walk to the court. He recounted all of this in a letter that was later given to Senator Charles Sumner, who would go on to read Dr. Alexander, his account on the floor of the Senate. And as a result of this, he actually tried to introduce legislation that would end segregation on streetcars in Washington. Initially, the legislation failed. However, by March of 1865, it would be written into the franchise agreements for the various streetcar companies that operated in Washington that they could not discriminate or deny service to anyone based on their color. So when people would ask at the museum whether Washington streetcars were segregated, the answer, it's kind of a two-part answer. No, they weren't segregated by law. That did not mean that people didn't segregate by custom. But at least, officially, Washington streetcars were not segregated. And as early as 1864 and 1865, it would be written into the franchise agreements for each of these companies that would operate that they could not discriminate based on color. So, once again, we see, an individual challenge to, the practice and, the custom of segregation. But, there's definitely seeing that, all across in various cities, African Americans were not willing to accept what was being handed to them as you must ride, you either have to ride on a separate car or you must ride at a designated spot on the car and risk being thrown off the car at the whim of the operating crew. So by the 1860s, horse cars are continuing to operate, but by the late 1880s and after the Civil War in the late 1880s, the transit industry itself would undergo a revolution with the introduction of the electric streetcar. And so with the change from animal power to electrical power, streetcars start to proliferate throughout the United States. Lots of cities start to add them or either convert their horse lines over to electric lines, and the new companies are also formed. And so the streetcar itself becomes not so much a novelty, but it becomes a necessity for the urban dweller. And for people of color, having access and equal access to electric streetcars was very important because it was similar to anyone else. It was being able to have access to employment, to any kind of medical, needs, any kind of things that you would just need to just kind of go about your daily life. But the other thing that was also occurring around the same time was the beginning of the codification of these local practices and customs into law. We see this in 1896 with the Supreme Court decision of Plessy versus Ferguson, where a gentleman by the name of Homer Plessy challenges the practice on a passenger train in Louisiana, knowing that he is going to be ejected. I believe Homer Plessy was a light-skinned African-American man who could pass for white if he wanted to, but he boarded a train, I think in New Orleans, and sat in the area that was designated for whites and then informed the conductor that he was an African-American man. Of course, the resulting decision that was handed down by the Supreme Court was of course, separate but equal, where it was believed that you could provide similar accommodations to people of color as long as they were equal to their white counterparts. Obviously, we know that in practice, this was not the case. And this image that I have here is something that was described as, it was called a race panel. And so this would be, this was from a streetcar in Birmingham, Alabama. And so these panels could be placed on the seat backs. As you can see, the two posts, they could be moved forward or backward depending on the direction that the car was going in, and also depending on the route that the car was operating over, whether it was a route that may have more African Americans riding versus more white passengers. But beginning in the early 1890s, you start seeing this codification of these segregation laws throughout the South. In one case, there is an example, me being from Kentucky, I could not include something from Kentucky. But there was, and sometimes these challenges to segregation would yield almost humorous results. This occurred one evening on a interurban operated by the Bluegrass Traction Interurban Company. This was a company that operated interurban service from Lexington, Kentucky to Paris, Kentucky, which is the next county over. And on that, the evening of February 12th, 1904, an African-American woman boarded an interurban car and sat in the section that was designated for African-Americans. The rest of the car, though, became full. And so about 8 or 10 white gentlemen went into the section where this African-American woman was seated. And so she told the conductor that if it is the law that I have to sit in this section of the car, then I should be allowed to sit here without any other interference from these white gentlemen. And so the conductor, for whatever reason, in this situation, decided to agree with this woman. And so the conductor then informed the white gentleman passengers that they would have to move out and back to the crowded section for white passengers and stand. And so it was a very unusual. I read this and I couldn't believe it, but she kind of stood her ground on that one. And even though the law said that she could not sit in this, she had to sit in this section, she said, well, okay, well, if that's going to be the case, then I should be allowed to sit here without it being crowded with other people. And so that's how it turned out. But in other cases, the challenges to racial segregation would lead to violence. And this was the case in Atlanta. The company at the time was the Atlanta Consolidated Streetcar. And in the early 1890s, the state of Georgia passed a series of segregation laws that initially required the streetcar companies to provide separate streetcars. So again, this notion that you would have a car for white passengers and then a car for African-American passengers. Obviously, as a transit operator, this would be a huge challenge because you'd have to maintain these separate fleets of cars, which would be very expensive. At any given time, neither of the cars might be entirely full, so you might end up operating this whole system at a loss because none of your cars are full. But in 1891, the state of Georgia passes the law requiring these separate cars. And then, of course, this is followed up by 1896 with the Plessy versus Ferguson decision from the Supreme Court. And then in 1900, the state of Georgia tried to reissue this same law requiring separation. And so as a result of this, the African-American community in Atlanta did stage a streetcar boycott. So they actually boycotted the streetcars. They stayed off of them for quite some time. But the tension between the white community and the African-American community would continue to build over the years, with the local newspapers writing kind of these inflammatory stories about African-Americans and violence in an attempt to disenfranchise African-Americans from access to the vote. But this would all come to a head in September of 1906 when racial violence finally broke out around the streetcars and the segregation of streetcars, resulting in white mobs going throughout Atlanta and pulling African-Americans off of the streetcars. And I think the result was, about 11 African-Americans died as a result of this riot. And so coming into the early 1900s, while there were still challenges and boycotts throughout the South by African-Americans who were protesting against the practice of segregation on public transportation, the violence that would come along with that, in some cases, put a damper on the attempt to mobilize against this, and not drawing attention to the community, which may result in violence. Throughout the early 1900s, we see the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, racial violence continuing into the 30s. And then by the time that the United States enters World War II, we're starting to see a different challenge. So there's still a challenge for access to or equal access to public transportation as a customer and as a user. But now there's also a new challenge to gain equal access to public transit and to streetcars as an employee of the transit company. By the 1940s, because of the manpower shortage due to the draft in World War II, transit companies around the country start to face challenges of how to, have enough employees to provide service, particularly in cities that had large, war industrial, factories and things. In some cases, one example is in Detroit, Michigan, which in 1943 experienced a race riot, in part because of the perception of white residents of Detroit seeing African Americans in positions of authority on public transit. By the 40s, because of the manpower shortage, the Detroit Street Railways, which was the operator in Detroit, began hiring African American men and women to operate on the streetcars. A little bit about the cars themselves, just from an operating perspective. Some of the cars, such as this one that's pictured here, required two people to operate them. So you had a motorman and a conductor. And so it would not be uncommon to board a streetcar such as this, a Peter Witt car, and your entire operating crew is African American. I had an opportunity to meet a woman who had been a conductorette some years ago. I was riding on the train back from Cleveland. I was on an Amtrak, and when you sit on Amtrak, if you're in the dining car, they just put people with you to fill up the table. And we, began, conversation, and she had told me that, she had lived in Detroit during World War II. She had been hired as a conductorette, and so she had said that, her experience was that, sitting at the little booth midway at the back of the car, you would have to pass the conductor or the conductorette, to pay your fare. And she said on a daily basis, she would be called names. People would slam the money down in front of her. They wouldn't touch, they wouldn't allow her to touch her if she was giving back change. She was told that that job belonged to a white man. So, all of this, but she took it and she enjoyed the work. Actually, this was kind of her first real job. It was, it gave her a certain sense of autonomy. And so, she, in spite of the discrimination that she experienced, she did enjoy the work. But Detroit was not unusual in places that were desegregating the platform, as it were. I was also reading about where in Philadelphia, in I believe 1944, the Philadelphia Transportation Company began to desegregate the platform and hire African American men on as streetcar and bus operators. But this was after federal troops had to be called out as a result of a strike. So there was a strike, a wildcat strike. And of course, Philadelphia being, a huge industrial center, especially during World War II, you could not have your transit system not in operation because of, the thousands of people every day that relied on the streetcars and the buses and the subways and the elevators to get to and from these war jobs. So Franklin Roosevelt would actually call out federal troops to, I think initially it was to operate the cars and buses, but then they would, the transit company hired African Americans. And so the federal troops would then ride the streetcars and buses to prevent any outbreaks of racial violence. And this was all being observed in Washington very closely, because at the same time in Washington, there were also challenges by the African American community to access to access jobs with the Capital Transit Company. At the time of the United States entry into World War II, I believe Capital Transit, their employment consisted of about 20% of the employees for Capital Transit were African Americans. So, but they were primarily in either unskilled or semi-skilled jobs. A little bit of history about the Washington streetcar system. For those who don't know, the Washington streetcar system did have a unique operating characteristic in that it did use the conduit system for power collection. So for the image that you can see here of the PCC car, if you look down at the tracks in front of it, you'll see these hatch plates, hatch covers. This was part of the conduit system. And at certain places in the city, when the cars would go, out farther out into the suburbs of Washington, they could switch from conduit power to overhead, and then they would do the reverse when they were coming in from the suburbs and coming into downtown. Well, at these plow pits, that would be where they would take the plow off the bottom of the car and then put the trolley pole up, and the car would go on out into the suburbs. Those jobs as pitmen, as they were called, were frequently held by African-American men because they were very dangerous and dirty jobs. And you were in a pit, which is essentially an underground vault all day. You were right next to 600 volts of current. You had to, depending on the headways on the streetcar line itself, you might have a car coming over your pit every minute or so, or every 90 seconds. So you had to work very fast. You were in the pit in all kinds of weather. So, but there were also other positions within the company where you have hostlers who worked in the car barns, who might move cars around for just, for maintenance work and things like that. By the 1940s, though, with the manpower shortage and the number of men who worked for Capital Transit going off to war, there was a challenge on how to fill those positions. Initially, there was an attempt to desegregate the platform, but the politics and the attitudes of people at the time, particularly with the leadership of Capital Transit, did not allow for this. And so the challenge of desegregating the platform in Washington began as early as 1941, but it would not end until 1955. But during that time, you also saw, because the company would not hire African-American men, they did hire white women to work on the platform. So this was the first time that you see, I believe it was called the Women's Auxiliary Transit Service, or the WATS, and they would hire white women to work on the platform. But behind the scenes, throughout the war, there was a challenge to desegregate the platform. There was one attempt. There was one gentleman, his last name was Sims, who was African-American, who was hired by Capital Transit to begin training as an operator. But when he reported to the streetcar division on Benning Road to begin his on-the-job training, none of the operators would train him. They refused to do it. And so as a result, Capital Transit decided to offer him a job as a janitor. He refused to accept that. And then as a result of that, Capital Transit did fire him. But there was one example where there was one African-American woman who was hired by Capital Transit, and for 5 months in 1943 and 1944, her name was Sarah Grayson. She did operate streetcars in Washington, but that was because Ms. Grayson was a very light-skinned woman. There's an article in the Washington Afro-American that kind of describes her appearance, like a very light-skinned, blue eyes. And so when she applied for the company, people just assumed that she was a white woman. And so she worked at Capital Transit for 5 months with no one knowing, until one day a neighbor of hers went into the company to apply for a job and was told that we don't hire African Americans on the platform. And then they kind of outed her, as it were. And they said, well, you have Sarah Grayson, and she's an African American woman. Of course, as a result of that, she was terminated. But that was one example where she did operate streetcars and for a few months at least. But with the end of World War II, you start seeing this, again, more challenges, not only to access to the platform for public transit jobs, but also just in general, desegregation in general. With the late 40s and coming into the 1950s in Washington, the transit company came under new leadership, new ownership. So you start seeing the support within the union start to shift as more African Americans do work for the company, even if they're not putting on a uniform and taking a bus or a streetcar out on the street. But there is sort of this, kind of groundswell of support for desegregation. But you also see in the early 50s, the beginnings of desegregation in other cities on the platform. So Baltimore, for example, begins to desegregate its operator positions in 1953. So they start hiring African Americans to operate their streetcars and buses. 1954, you start seeing the Supreme Court decision of Brown versus the Board of Education, which made school desegregation unconstitutional. So the attitudes begin to change. And then by the end of 54 and beginning of 1955 in January, the Capital Transit Company begins the process of accepting applications from African Americans. At first, they decided that they were going to promote from within the maintenance department, first African American men, and then they would also accept applications out. And so by March of 1955, Capital Transit has its first African American streetcar operator and bus operator. And so the reason why all of this is so significant, and the reason why this is so important to me, is because I often dedicate this presentation to my uncle, Charles Morton, and he passed away some years ago, over 30 years ago now, but he was a transit operator in Detroit, Michigan, immediately following World War II up until the 1970s. And so as a child, we would go and visit him every summer, and he would always tell me stories about his experiences driving the buses in Detroit. And, some of them were funny, some of them not so funny, but it was because of his stories and his interest in transit. It was how I became interested in transit and would later go on to work with a career in transportation. He was also the person who took me on my first streetcar in Detroit in 1981. So this was a very personal topic for me because I saw the benefit of someone that I knew having access to this industry. He drove buses for a number of years, but because of that work, he was able to attain, a very middle-class lifestyle. He owned his own home. He, had 2 cars in the driveway. He was an Oldsmobile man, so that was his thing. He and his wife, my aunt, were able to travel. I think they drove to all 48 states over the course of their marriage. And so, they wouldn't have been able to accomplish these things if he had not had this job and had this career. And so, knowing the importance of transportation, both as a user but also as an employee of transportation. We can make the same arguments today with having equal access to public transportation, because now that we're in this post-COVID time, what is transit going to look like in the years going forward? But we know that people will always need to have this equal access, because it does mean having a chance at some upward mobility. So that does conclude my presentation. Hopefully you found it interesting. What I think we're going to do now is we're going to open up the chat, I believe, and then we're going to take some questions. And so I'll be happy to answer any questions, or if you have any comments or anything you'd like to share, I'd be more than happy to hear them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. Oh, I'm getting some echo. All right, I'm going to switch over here to let everybody know what's coming up before everyone scatters, but we will be able to get to questions in just a minute, and I did get a couple good ones in the chat. We do have another Trolleyology coming up March 8th, which is a Wednesday. If you were in the last program, please note the change of date from March 7th to March 8th. So that'll be the Dayton and Xenia Railway and how not to abandon a rail line by Tom Morrow out of Dayton. He is going to explain about this company and how they did everything wrong when they decided to abandon in 1905, including not telling their passengers that they were abandoning the rail line. So that'll be very interesting. And of course, we open for the season March 31st at the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum with Bunny Trolley, one of our bigger events of the year. And again, I want to thank Eric for the presentation tonight and everybody for joining us. You can visit patrolley.org/support to learn how to volunteer, become a member, or make a donation to the museum. And I want to thank everybody again who donated during the registration process tonight. So we're getting in from the chat. One of the early comments that I wanted to bring up, Eric, was about Elizabeth Jennings Graham, and how she had the means to I'm trying to find Larissa's comment. Oh, yeah, she was very fortunate to have the resources to take that case to court. And then Larissa had also mentioned in a separate chat that to mention nuisance laws, and even after segregation was outlawed, all these rules that you could kick people off the streetcar because of bad behavior and things like that. Could you speak to any of that?
Yes. So definitely the part about Elizabeth Jennings, first, because looking more into her history, you realize that this was an upper middle class woman whose family, I think on her father's side, had family that had served in the Revolutionary War, and they were property owners in New York City. So they were very, very well connected and had a lot of resources available to them that most people of that time, certainly people of color, would not have had. But also the comment about the nuisance laws, very much so. You see nuisance laws being used as a way to allow for, in the case of, if we keep it to just streetcar operators, to kind of decide who they want to allow on or not on their cars, regardless of whether that person is complying with the rules or not. So if you're a person of color and you're sitting on the car and you're, let's say you are minding your own business, you could be, perceived as being, either disrespectful to the operating crew. You could be, if you are a man of color, you could be perceived as a threat to, a woman on the car. So it gave a lot of latitude to the operators, the operating crews, the motormen or the operators and the conductors, about who got to ride and who didn't, or who was allowed on and who was not. If you think about, African Americans often worked in jobs where they either, work with their hands. So they may work in a factory or work, on a farm or something. So if you get on the car and you're in, your clothes are, you've been working in a field or working in a factory, so your clothes might not be clean. You might be perceived as being too dirty to ride with other people, so you might not be allowed on the car. So the nuisance laws were very much in force, in addition to the segregation laws themselves.
Sure. And then Philip Sauerlander, a volunteer at Rock Hill Trolley Museum, asks, did any transit companies resist having to desegregate? He said segregate passengers, but I think it means desegregate.
There were, especially for the companies that operated in the South, they did not like this notion of having to have two sets of cars for their passengers. And if you think about it, it's really more like four sets, because you would have to have cars that you operated in the winter that were closed, and then you would have open cars that you would operate in the summer. So having to have all of this operating equipment around that would, most times maybe sitting in the barn or not fully used, was not something that they were interested in, because, other thing I didn't mention was that, these were all private companies. So they were in business to make a profit, and you wanted to do that in the most economical way possible. And what you wanted were full streetcars as often as possible. So having to have, two sets of cars where they might be half full each, was not good business. Now, it didn't mean that they had, some ideas of, that they thought that, people of color were equal to whites or anything like that, but they were not thrilled about this idea of maintain these separate fleets, because that gets very expensive very fast.
Yeah. So I have marked it so that you're able to unmute yourself if you would like to pose a question or a comment directly. We're still getting very nice comments in the chat box here. Larissa recommends right to ride, streetcar boycotts, and African American citizenship in the era of Plessy versus Ferguson. If anybody wants to take a deeper dive into that.
Charles Bogart here. Grew up in Newport, Kentucky. Now
yes.
Kentucky. So I was told this, I've never really checked this through, that Kentucky's Jim Crow law only applied to railroads. And that when it came to streetcars, that was either by franchise or by public opinion. That in Louisville in 1860, something or the other, there was a federal court case allowing African Americans to ride anywhere on the streetcar. So as a result, the Jim Crow law was written to exclude streetcars. Have you ever delved into Kentucky?
I had heard, and I think I've heard a similar case. I want to say it was two African-American gentlemen who, they were, I think, removed from a streetcar. A similar thing. I think they were on their way to church or something, but there was a case that came as a result of that. And I want to say, I have to go back and look at this, but I want to say that they won. So the segregation of cars really only applied to like interurbans.
Right.
There was like, anything that going outside of a city limits of, from Lexington to Frankfurt or Frankfurt to Louisville or something like that. And, I guess it came under a different jurisdiction because I think the interurbans did come under the, kind of the railroad authority versus, maybe your local public utility authority or something like that. But so the practice wasn't evenly applied. I'll say it like that. It was different practices in different places and different customs within those practices. Just to, before we go on to the next one, looking at, I think Montgomery, in Lexington and Montgomery, my parents said, when you rode the bus in Lexington, you boarded at the front of the bus, you paid your fare, and then you walked to the back of the bus. But in Montgomery, the custom was you boarded at the front of the bus. If you were African-American, then you stepped off the bus and then reboarded through the center doors. And then that could be an opportunity for the operator to close the doors and leave you. So you had to then wait for the next bus. So it was a very uneven practice, and it made traveling as an African-American kind of difficult because you had to know what the custom was, fairly quickly, so you try to find some, an African-American person and say, hey, what is the practice here? Because it may be different from where you came from, and you can find yourself in trouble really fast if you don't follow the custom.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Eric, fascinating presentation. Thank you for it very much. I shared some pictures earlier with Christian, a couple of days ago with Christian, Johannesburg, South Africa, where apartheid was the rule instead of segregation. They had red cars for the European folks and silver cars for the residents of the townships, which were the, I guess you'd say they were Africans instead of African Americans. To use, and fascinating, where they actually had two fleets. Two schedules. And again, thank you for the presentation. And Christian, thank you for putting it together.
No, thank you. And I mean, I will say, obviously, I can't cover, 100 years, but finding the different practices all over, the United States and then all over the world in different places about how this was addressed. I think one of the things, if anybody knows anything about our museum, the Trolley Museum, we have two cars from Germany. And so, one of the things that we talk about, or at least we are thinking about talking about, is how, as Nazism is gaining momentum, one of the things they started to do was, restrict access to public transit for people who were Jewish. And so it's understood the importance of being able to get on a streetcar or a tram or a bus and go somewhere. And so the first thing you do is to take that away from people. So it's, if anything else, hopefully this discussion that we're having tonight and the presentation will encourage you to, find out more, because there's so much more about this topic that I only feel like I've ever scratched the surface on, but there's so many other stories about this that are equal, interesting as well.
Well, and I think, like you said at the beginning of the program, how a lot of people just associate this with the southern states, and as you have shown, it was also a problem in the north.
Yes, I've actually seen, I think even in, reading one account of it, even in Omaha, Nebraska, the local NAACP chapter was challenging practices on Omaha streetcars. So that, Omaha's Midwest. So had never thought of that, but it's, just kind of broadens the horizon about where these, things were applied and, how people responded to them as well.
Rich Allman, I see you have your hand up.
Thanks, Kristen. And thank you, Eric, for a terrific presentation. Two brief comments and then a brief question. Philadelphia Suburban Red Arrow Lines was very late hiring African Americans. I don't think it was till the early 1960s that there were bus and trolley drivers on the Red Arrow lines. The other thing I remember as a small kid, my parents took me on a vacation to Miami Beach, and we stayed near Collins Road and Lincoln Road, Collins Avenue and Lincoln Road. And there was, I think, a bus company there called the Miami Beach Street Railway. It ceased to be a street railway company decades before. But I remember seeing a bus, and the only thing it said on the destination sign when I was a kid was colored. And I asked my parents, where's the bus going? How are people supposed to know? And they really didn't have a good answer, and that's stuck with me for so many years. One question, Eric, did Capital Transit, I had heard that Capital Transit, when the line to Roslyn across the Key Bridge made African-American my day job, passengers go to the back of the streetcar. Is that correct?
I've been trying to find that out myself, because I know that for the interurbans that operated from downtown Washington and crossed over into Northern Virginia, they did segregate, so they did, once you, got to, I think, either on the Virginia side or, right before they crossed the river, the operating crew would go through and separate out everybody. So when the cars went into Virginia, either they were already segregated or, they would be segregated soon thereafter. I don't know if the streetcar that went just to Roslyn and came back, if they segregated as well, because it just, it would have just gone across the bridge, looped right there in Roslyn, and came right back over. My assumption would be also, some African Americans may have just segregated themselves because they did not want to have the operating crew do it for them, because that would draw attention to themselves. And I did recall a quote from Mary Church Terrell, where she talks about this, and this was in the early 1900s, but of the interurbans crossing into Northern Virginia and the injustice of, again, law-abiding African Americans who were just, they paid their fare just like everybody else, but having to suffer the injustice of being, forcibly moved to a certain section of the streetcar before.
Well, it's an indignity, not just an injustice. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, yes, but to answer your question, I'm not sure if the streetcar that just went to Roslyn segregated, but I do know that the interurbans that went into Roslyn and then went on from there did segregate.
And businesses, that they didn't like having two sets of streetcars, but they also had two sets of toilets, two sets of water fountains, and everything else.
Mm-hmm. Had to have all the separate facilities.
Yeah, since you mentioned two separate facilities, once again, I came out of Northern Kentucky next to Cincinnati. My first job was with the state of Kentucky, and they sent me down to Hickman, Kentucky, which is on the Tennessee line next to the Mississippi River. I was thirsty, and I walked in, saw a water fountain, and grabbed a drink of water. And I was almost beat up and killed because I was drinking out of the colored fountain, and I wasn't drinking out of the white fountain. So as you said, it went both ways. And I mean, the county judge came out, the sheriff both talked to me about being disrespectful and using that and not being the person I'm supposed to be. And I was totally unaware of this. And I had to be careful from then on what county I was in, how I behaved. So it's in the early 60s. So it was there.
It was really, interesting to see how, the customs were enforced, but, not just for African Americans, but also anyone who wasn't familiar with the custom at all, people who were visiting or something like that. If you didn't know what was supposed to happen, like you said, somebody would come and correct you very quickly. And that correction may be verbal or it may even be physical. So you never knew what you were going to get. And I think that was also the other thing that made it so scary, was because you didn't know what was going to happen. It may be a very simple thing and, it's very unpleasant, but you could go on about your business, or you could be the result of violence and not live to tell the tale.
My dad was from Jamaica. His family's from Jamaica, got real deep roots in Jamaica. And he used to tell me stories of riding the trams. He called them puddle jumpers. And all of the crews were black. Almost all he probably was one of the few white people on the car. And when they stopped service with Jamaica Public Service Company, when they stopped service, there was a protest by the women. because what they would do in market day is they'd come down and they were open cars and they could fill up the cars with all their produce and everything. And that didn't work with a bus. And what they do now is they use trucks. So there was a protest by the market women against the abolishing of the trams. Anyway, when he flew into the States, he called it the States, during World War II, he flew into Miami on a seaplane and then came up on the train to Iowa, and he was absolutely appalled. He'd never seen anything like it. And he always told me, he thought for sure there would be, when the soldiers came back, the black soldiers came back, there was going to be a race war. And he always told me, repeatedly told me, that this country owed Martin Luther King a tremendous vote of gratitude for preventing that from happening.
It was, it was interesting to see when they talk about the veterans returning from World War II, the African Americans, because they had been sent abroad to fight for freedom and democracy overseas. And so when they came back, the expectation was very different for them. They were like, well, if we have to go, if we're going to defend our country and our homeland abroad, then we want the same, we want the same rights that we've just been fighting for overseas. We want them back here. And you start seeing with, that generation, and then I guess their children later on who would be involved in the civil rights movement, but you start seeing this change in an attitude that we're not going to just accept what we just left and came back, to. Everybody's very different now. And one other thing I just wanted to add, which was somewhat related, but growing up in Lexington, at least up until the early 80s, there was a bus line that would operate out to where my dad worked. He worked for Sears and Roebuck, so he worked at the shopping mall. And so I would ride the bus out every so often, and then there would always be one variation of the route that would kind of peel off the main highway and then kind of wind its way back through the neighborhood and then rejoin the highway and go on out to the mall. And I remember asking my dad one day, because no one ever got on or off when it did that. And I asked my dad, like, why does it do that? And he said, oh yeah, that's a maid's run. I said, a maid's run? He's like, yeah, it would take, the African-American domestics who worked on one side of town, and it would take them through this white subdivision and drop them off at the houses where they would clean. And then over time, the domestics either retired or passed on, but they never changed the bus route. So by the early 80s, all of these women had, retired or passed away, but the bus was still going through there as if they still worked there. And it wasn't until the late 80s or early 90s when they finally changed the route and eliminated that piece. But it was just this kind of little bit of history that if you didn't know what that was or why it did it, it wouldn't make any sense. And it wouldn't seem like it was any significance at all. But understanding that's how a lot of these African-American women got to these jobs as domestics. They rode on the buses, and the buses would take them through these subdivisions and drop them off. And they were the only ones riding through these areas. They would get off and get on. But it was just an interesting thing to learn about that, that particular aspect of transit and who transit served, in one form or another, I guess.
Eric?
Yes.
Hi, Harry Donahue here. Great presentation. I was friends years ago with a motorman, Ernie Moser. He's passed on now. He was a trolley operator in Philly in 1944. You mentioned they all went on strike because they moved up some black shop guys and trained them to run the trolleys. He told me that President Roosevelt gave them like 2 days to get back to work. He said, if you don't go back to work, you'll be in the Army within a week. If you're too old to go in the Army, you will not have a job for the duration of the war. And that got their attention real fast. And they were back at work. And that was the end of the old union, and the TWU 234, which I think is still SEPTA's union. They had a new union starting after that. But when he told them they would be in the Army within a week, they decided to go back to work.
Yeah,
Harry
and Eric, George Gula, it was a little more detailed than that. The Army general in charge of the troops was a man named Philip Hayes. He was Major General. And he argued for 2 days trying to get these men back and women because 1943 PTC began hiring women. And it was Philip Hayes that said, if you're not back on Monday, you're in the Army on Tuesday, you will be in training camps in California, and I'll make sure you go to the Pacific. Now, I'm sure of the two theaters, European and Asian, the Pacific was a far worse place to be. And the Army rode those cars, 2 and 3 soldiers on each car. I've seen pictures with fixed bayonets. Yeah, the guys were smiling, but they were told not to take any nonsense. And they rode for 6 weeks. There were also jeeps running around the city, making sure there wasn't any trouble. And the people were absolutely happy because they had seen what had happened in Detroit. And there had been some minor outbursts in various parts of Philadelphia during this, before the troops came in.
Yeah.
So they knew nothing bad was going to happen. But I never had that choice.
I never had that choice. I got drafted.
They got that. Hayes said he would give them that choice. Now, one day I was down at the East Penn traction meet, and I met a young black fellow. He was a streetcar buff. We were taking pictures down at Woodland Depot, and he told me he had a chance to interview one of those original 8 black operators. And the white population wasn't particularly happy with them. I mean, they said how you paid your fare back then, put it in a fare box and you got change, and they threw the money on the floor. They were pulling the pole. So the population wasn't particularly, they had to get used to it, I guess, at first. But the threat of the draft is what brought everybody back.
And, were there problems in Pittsburgh?
To my knowledge, no. Now, Art Ellis, who's a museum member, I actually had his job at the Port Authority putting timetables and schedules together. And I had actually asked him that question. And the first black operator in Pittsburgh was somewhere in the 50s. And there wasn't, at that point, there wasn't any nonsense as far as outburst strikes. But Art remembers the superintendent of transportation telling everybody to watch this guy, and you tell me everything he does. I believe this man did rise through the management ranks at Port Authority. So, but I can't think of the name that I was given, but Art said, you tell me everything he does. That's what, so he was suspicious at least.
Any further? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Eric. I was going to ask if there were any more questions, but go ahead.
Last one. But we, at the museum, we talk about Maya Angelou as one example, because she was a streetcar conductor in San Francisco in the 40s. And she said, I think there was an interview with her, and I think she had said that, her mother asked her, like, well, why do you want to do this? She said, well, I like the uniform. She's like, okay. And so she allowed her daughter to apply for the job, and she got the job. But then what she would do is she would drive behind the streetcar. So she would follow the streetcar around while her daughter was on it, and she kept a gun under her seat.
Ooh.
Just in case anything happened to her daughter. She could hop out and just right up there and take care of her daughter and make sure. But I think Maya Angelou, she was 17 at the time. So, when you're 17, it's a different world, how you perceive the world. But, when she told that story, she's like, oh yeah, my mother, she had and her mother, like, to know her mother, this would not be an unusual thing when she talks about her mother, but she said, she had a seat under the car, under the car seat, and she would drive my entire route while I was working. And if anything happened, I knew she was right there. So, that's good looking out.
There's one thing I do recall many years ago when visiting one of the earlier trolley museums in New England. On their New Orleans car, they still had it marked as a segregated car, just to remind people just the way it was. And I think that was a good educational thing.
Yeah, we haven't had it because I don't think there are that many Southern cars available now, because I guess because a lot of the systems in the South closed, so early. But I do recall when the PCCs went from Birmingham to Toronto, they showed up with the little window cards indicating, and they had to take them out before the cars could go into service. So I don't know if anybody at TC ever kept any of those. I mean, that would be a great object to see. They came straight from Alabama to Toronto, but that was how it was, unfortunately. So.
Yeah. Well, those cars then went to Philly, and while the signs weren't there, the holes in the seats for the signs were there.
Yeah.
People had questions about them, and they thought, well, you put your umbrella in. Somebody thought you put your cigar in, and I don't think anybody knew the reason, but they were still there.
All righty. Anything further for Eric before we wrap up? All right. Well, thank you.
Again, Christian, thank you for organizing this. And Eric, thanks for a great presentation.
Very good.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Well, we are very happy to have hosted this program. Thank you again to Eric.
Thank you.
Oh, and thank you so much to everybody who joined us tonight. Thank you to those of you who donated, and hopefully we'll see you at the next one. Have a great evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks.